Hello, my name is Ashley and I will be doing my presentation for course 648 on adoption. Adoption defined. Adoption can be defined in three ways. The first is a personal act. This involves three sets of people collectively known as the adoption triad, and that's the adoptee, the birth family, and the adoptive family. And this is considered a lifelong practice rather than a single act. Then there's the legal process, which is defined as the method provided by law to establish the legal relationship of a parent and child between persons who are not so related by birth. And finally, social service. This addresses the needs of the adoption triad members through such steps as identifying and legally freeing children to be adopted, selecting and preparing families for adoption, preparing and placing children in adoptive families, and providing post-placement and post-adoptive services. There's a variety of types of adoption. The first is domestic, which is adoptions that take place in the U.S. and they can be public or private. There's public adoptions, which come from children who are previously or currently in foster care, and they involve children in state welfare systems. There's private adoption or private domestic adoption, which goes through nonprofit agencies that are licensed by the state or through independent adoption agencies that involve a third party. There are international adoptions, which are when a child is adopted outside of the country. There's transracial adoptions, which is when a child of a different race than the adoptive parents is adopted. There are special needs adoptions, which are when a child has a developmental need. There are step-parent adoptions, which is when a couple is married and one parent is not the birth parent but chooses to adopt the child. There's related adoption, when a family member adopts, such as an uncle, grandparent, sibling. There's open adoption, which all records are open and the child can find their birth parent later on as they have information about their birth parents. And there's closed adoption, where the birth parent does not choose to release that information to the child. Some of the risks of adoption. Loss and grief. A child may feel that they have lost their parent, similarly to when you lose a parent who has passed away. And there's really not anything or social sort of way that we identify that or we allow a child to grieve that loss. They may feel angry, anxiety, fear, from losing that connection with their birth parent. They may also have identity development issues. They may feel like, why have they been placed up for adoption? Where are my birth parents? Do I have siblings? Do I look like my parents? Am I similar to my birth parents? And it can be hard for them to identify as they don't feel like they have a connection to their birth family. Often accompanying issues of identity are issues of self-esteem. Some adoptee people may feel like they're different, they're out of place, they've been rejected or unwanted by family, and that can be hard for them to move past. And lastly is genetic information. Adopted people often lack information about their birth family, their genetics, their medical history, which can be difficult. Additionally, disruption is something that happens during adoption. This is the process that ends after the child has been placed in an adoptive home, but before they've legally been adopted. And this results in a child being returned or put back into foster care. This happens in 10 to 25% of adoptions across the U.S. Why are they disrupted? So some of the main reasons that an adoption is disrupted is the age of the child. The older the child, the higher likelihood they have of being placed back in foster care. That likelihood is about 6% more likely. Additionally, there may be emotional or behavioral issues that are displayed by the child, and these issues can be difficult for a parent to deal with. They may not have known about these issues prior to the adoption, or they may not know how to deal with these issues. White children tend to have a lower disruption rate than African American children, and interestingly, children with 2 or 3 siblings who are placed together are at a higher risk of disruption, but when children with siblings of 4 or more siblings are placed, they have a lower risk of disruption. Dissolution. This happens when the adoption has already been legalized between the adoptive parent and the child, and they choose to either sever it voluntarily or involuntarily, and this results in the child being placed back in foster care or into a new adoptive home. And this happens in approximately 1% of public agency adoptions. Why do these dissolve? A lot of the time this is lack of information about where to go for services. So they may be struggling with a child but not feel they have places to go to have the child cared for or to help them care for the child. Additionally, the costs of these services can be very high. For instance, OT, speech, PT, tutoring, behavioral therapy are a few things that they may need, and those costs become very high. Statistics for adoption. Adoption statistics are very limited, and there's actually no single source that has the total number of adoptions in the United States. Some of the numbers we do have is we know there is an estimated 440,000-ish children in foster care, and that was as of 2017. In around 2007 and 2008, we had an estimated 136 children who were adopted. So if you look at that number, the 4,000 to the 136,000, there's a pretty big gap between children being put in permanent homes and children who are adopted. Just for a smaller perspective or smaller scale, Pennsylvania, where our school is located, approximately every year 4,973 children are adopted. And in Maine, which is where I live, there's only 843 adoptions. Public agency adoptions accounted for 39% of adoptions in 2007, and in 2008, 41%. Intercountry adoptions accounted for 14% of all adoptions, and nearly half of the adoptions were from other sources. So those sources might be private agencies or individual agencies. More than 60% of children in foster care spend 2 to 5 years in the system before being adopted, and almost 20% spend 5 or more years in foster care. And then some never get adopted. And one statistic is the longer a child is in foster care, the older they get, the less likely they are to be adopted. So that's another gap between foster care and adoption. This diagram just shows a distribution of race of children for adoption, and this was in 2009. So 37% of children adopted were white or non-Hispanic, 15% were Hispanic, 23% were Black, 15% were Asian, and then there's 9% of other. We'll move into the history. I'm not going to go into detail about all of them. There's a lot of history on adoption, and it will go over my time, but I'm going to focus on some of the really important dates that we had here. So 1800s, or early on in the 1800s, there really wasn't a formal way of adopting a child. They used a sort of informal economic and conditional contract. So that was based on exchange of labor. Sometimes a child was an indentured servant. Sometimes they were apprentice. If a family was poor, they may send their child out to be a maid in a more well-off family. So there was really no welfare set in place for the treatment or care of these children. In 1851, Massachusetts did, as the first state in the U.S., have an act, the Adoption of Children Act, that started, and this is where they really started to recognize that children's welfare was important, and it was more important than the work that they could provide. So they started to look out for children a little more, and this again started in Massachusetts. In 1854, the New York Children's Aid Society started. They were a group of people who raised money to provide shelters for children. Additionally, orphan trains began, and these happened from, they started really in around 1854 all the way to around 1930. So children who had been abandoned, their parents had died, had been put up for adoption, they were all placed on a train and carted across the U.S. And at each stop, all the children got out, and families could just select a child out from the grouping of children. So really no background checks or making sure that the child's welfare was at best interest. Some of these came out fine and children were well cared for. In other cases, they were indentured servants or child slave labor. Moving on to 68, the beginning of placing children out in private homes. So again, looking a little bit more out for the care of children, selecting them and placing them into homes to be cared for, educated, and taught a trade. Moving into 69, the New York Children's Foundling, which is kind of similar to the New York Children's Aid Society in that it was a charity that provided homes to children in New York, and it was started by three sisters. In 72, the New York State Charities Aid Association. And in 1891, Michigan was the first state to require adoptees to have good moral character and ability to support and educate the child in a suitable home. So in 1891, they started to really recognize that a home needed to be checked first to make sure that the child would be safe there. Prior to that, there really wasn't any way of securing or measuring a home's safety. In 1898, the Catholic Home Bureau was organized in New York. It was the first Catholic agency to place children in homes rather than orphanages. And that kind of was the model for many other states to start doing that. In the early 1900s, international adoptions began with the adoption of children from war that had been left behind or their parents had died. Moving on to 1904, it's the first social work school that opened in New York. In 1909, the White House Conference on Care of Dependent Children declared that poverty alone should not be grounds for removing children from home. So it started to be investigated what grounds for removing a child from home were necessary. Abuse was another one, or neglect, or sexual abuse, labor, things like that. From 1910 to 1930, the first specialized adoption agencies were founded, and there was a variety of those. In 1912, the United States Children's Bureau was founded. This was very important for the United States. It was the first federal agency opened, as well as the first around the world. And it focused on improving the lives of children and families, and it was created by President Taft. And additionally, a really important fact was Julia Lamthorpe was the first appointed chief for the federal agency, and she was the first woman to head a federal agency. Moving on to 1919 was the Russell Sage Foundation, which published the first professional child placing manual in the U.S., and it set a minimum standard for child placing.